Welcome back to Tabletop Glory. My name is Graham Johnson, and today we are going to be talking about wet palettes. Now, today's video is going to be featuring my Masterson's wet palette, but that's just because that's the one that I own. Everything we're going to be talking about in today's video is applicable to all wet palettes, or at least it should be. And what is my criteria for talking about this today? Well, I have been using wet palettes for about 8 years now, and I was using regular hard palettes for about 4 years prior to that. Now, there's a lot of things that I both love and a few things that I actually don't like about my wet palette, but we'll get into that in a minute. We're also going to be talking about some things that you may not like when you first start using a wet palette, or some problems you may be having after having used a wet palette for a while, and some solutions to fix those problems. Now, let's start with what might feel like an obvious question. Why do I need a wet palette? And the real answer is, you don't. It does help you do a lot of things, and when you're brand new, this can aid you in some more advanced techniques, but you can absolutely teach yourself how to do everything that a wet palette claims it can help you do on a hard palette. And I know that because I spent 4 years using a hard palette and saw no point in investing in a wet palette. And I spent probably about 1.5 years of having pretty much everyone I knew who knew I painted telling me I needed to get a wet palette. And I just didn't see the point. But I decided to pick one up one year for Christmas for myself as a gift, just to try it out and see what all the hullabaloo was about. And I ended up using it off and on for a few months, not really liking it. And then I had a bit of a major breakthrough with it that really made me start to like it. One of the biggest advantages to this wet palette is the fact that your paint just stays good forever. I'm not even kidding. I forgot paint in here for almost 3 weeks and it was still good. In fact, my family went on vacation for 3 weeks and I forgot to empty the wet palette and to leave it open so it could dry out. And then I came home and my paint was still wet after a 3-week vacation. Now, I live in Florida. There's not a lot of humidity in the air, which meant that the humidity that was in here and the moisture that was in here is what kept that paint good for 3 weeks. Now, do I recommend doing that on a regular basis? Absolutely not. You should not have to do that just to prove to yourself that it's worth getting one of these. But what that does mean is that over the course of 3 or 4 days of working on a single project, your paint is going to stay more than good. And if you have to walk away for a few days and then come back, it's still going to be good enough. Now, the longer you leave this moist without cleaning it out, the higher likelihood bacteria is going to start to grow in here. And one of the things I do every time I start a new project is I replace everything that's in here. And that doesn't mean that I replace the sponge, but I do take the sponge out, I wring it out as good as I can, I run lots of clean water through it, and then I put a fresh piece of palette paper in here. Now, what I've decided is we're going to go step by step from the very beginning, and I'm going to do from nothing, which you can see this is pretty well loved and pretty well used. We're going to start from nothing, and I'm going to show you how to prep your wet palette. And I'm basically going to take you through every stage that I do for this prep, which does involve following the instructions that come with the wet palette. Because believe it or not, it's not as simple as just dumping water in this and then expecting it to keep your paints good. There actually is a process to this. That having been said, different wet palettes may have different instructions, and if you're currently having issues with your wet palette, you may actually want to go read the instructions, because your prep for your wet palette may be wrong if you're having problems with your wet palette. Believe it or not, I didn't follow the instructions the first couple of times I did it, and then the third time when I did follow the instructions, it solved most of my problems. Now, when you first get a Masterson's wet palette, if you read the instructions, it's going to tell you to use the hottest water possible to steep your paper in, or at least they call it prep your paper in. Now, with a traditional wet palette and using traditional acrylics that are more heavy bodied, you can just get away with using the hottest setting on your tap. However, I find that by boiling your water and soaking the paper in that, you'll notice that the paper gets far more translucent. In my opinion, this is what allows the water to soak through from the sponge into your paint much more efficiently and works far better for miniature paints. I can often tell when someone brings me their wet palette and says that it's not working the way that they think it should or the same way that it works for other YouTubers by just looking at the palette paper. You can always tell if someone's boiled the water or not. The translucency difference really is that dramatic. Now, since a watch pot never boils, let's go ahead and jump cut to when we're ready to go ahead and start steeping the paper. Now, I like to use a baking tray because it just makes my life a little bit easier, but don't do what I do and dump it in all at once. Add a little bit first and then wait to see if your baking tray readjusts itself. I say that mainly because sometimes older baking trays can kind of pop or jump, and I don't want you to splash boiling water all over yourself. And then what you're going to do is you're going to gently lay your paper in this. Now, I like to use forks to kind of force it down under the surface of the water. And that's just so that I don't burn my fingertips. Now, you could just set it in there, but honestly, you really need the hot water on both sides of the paper. So just kind of flatten it out as best as you can. You'll know that this is working properly because you'll literally see air bubbles seeping out of the paper. I like to just go ahead and scrape those off with the fork, and once I notice the bulk of them have stopped, I let this sit for a minute while I prep the sponge. Now again, referencing back to our instructions, you're going to see that it says to prep the sponge using cold water. The water that comes out of my refrigerator is pretty cold, but if the water that comes out of your tap isn't that cold, you might want to put a couple of ice cubes in a cup and then just let that water sit while you boil your water for the paper. Now, if this is your first time using your wet palette, you may want to repeat this once or twice, but I like to do a little bit of a pre-soak where I use a little bit of my cold water to go ahead and re-moisten up the sponge if I've allowed it to dry out entirely. Now, if you end up folding it up like I do, please be gentle with it. You can actually break these sponges when they're dry if you're not careful. You will just break them in half. They're very brittle when they're dry. It's easy to poke holes in them and destroy them, so just be gentle with them. Once you've really soaked the sponge through, now we can dump the rest of our water into our palette. Now, how much water do you want to use? You can see here, you can literally see the water soaking into the sponge. This is why I recommend not just completely soaking the sponge through right away. What you want is just slightly more water than what the sponge can hold. You can see as I kind of rock this palette around, you can see a little bead of water running around the outside and it pooling in the corners. That's really what you want. You don't want tons of water sloshing around in the bottom of this palette. And then you're just going to go ahead and use one of your forks from earlier to fish that palette paper back out of the hot water, and you're going to place it in the palette. Now, this palette paper is meant for this palette, so it's a snug fit. It's going to completely take up the bottom of this palette. Some people like to trim down the paper just a little bit so that they can see the sponge to get a better understanding of just how wet the sponge is and when they need to top it off on water. So that might be something that you want to do for your own palette. For me, it's not a big deal. I constantly add water to my palette while I'm working with it every couple of hours anyway, so for me, it's not a big deal. You'll notice that there was quite a lot of moisture still on the surface of that palette paper, and the reality is that you're going to want to try and wick that off before you start adding paint to your palette. Now, if you're like me and this is one of the first steps you do when you're getting ready for a new project and you haven't kind of done everything, then go ahead and do more prep work. It'll soak back into the palette itself. But if you want to use the palette right away, you're going to want to go ahead and wick that excess moisture off using a paper towel. And the reason behind that is as soon as you add paint to your palette, it's just going to wick into that water and run all over the surface of your wet palette, and that is an issue that I see a lot of people who are new to using a wet palette have. If you ever look at their palette, their paint just kind of runs all over and does whatever and ends up in the sponge. It's because that there is an excess of moisture on the surface of the palette, or they're pre-thinning their paints in the bottle. That's something I used to do when I had my hard palette. I would add a little bit of thinner into the bottle just to kind of help loosen things up and also make my life a little bit easier when working with a hard palette for thinning out my paints later. That's a habit that I had to break because I noticed that my paint was just running all over my wet palette, and as soon as I stopped doing that, I stopped having that problem. Let's take a minute to talk about the longevity of your wet palette. Replacement sponges are going to be your best friend. If you get bacteria, just throw out your old sponge and get a new one. Let the palette dry out all the way and then put your new sponge in. and just move on with your life. I've heard of people dumping bleach into their wet palette to get rid of bacteria. And then I've also heard those same people complain the bacteria came back. So just get a new sponge and please move on with your life. I promise you. The reason I had to replace my last sponge is it started to fall apart and then got mold. So I bought a new sponge. That's the one you saw in today's video. It's a new sponge. And I haven't had any more problems with bacteria. Again, wet palette paper. It's super freaking cheap. Just buy an extra pack when you buy your wet palette. I promise you, a little bit goes a long way. I've only ever bought 2 of these, and I've still got plenty left to go. And I've been using a wet palette for forever. So just go ahead and buy some more palette paper. Now, also, replacement parts. And by parts, I do mean the sponge. This is really the only part in your wet palette. But if you're going to buy something on Kickstarter, or let's say it's the first generation of a wet palette from a company that you like and they've never done a wet palette before, you might want to buy extra sponges because there's no guarantee you're going to find them later down the road. And yeah, these are pretty large and you could cut them down to make them fit to a smaller wet palette and maybe scooch by and it'll work just fine. But that's a big maybe to try and rely on. And at the end of the day, if you could have just bought it when you bought the wet palette, then you'd be avoiding trying to figure it out later. So what I'm saying is if you can afford to buy extra sponges when you buy your wet palette, just go ahead and do it when you buy the wet palette. Don't try and figure it out later. Now let's go ahead and lay one to rest. Can you put metallic paints in your wet palette? Yeah, sure, why not? A lot of people will tell you that it will wick down into the sponge and then move over into other paints and magically make those metallic. Maybe back in the day that was the case. However, our hobby paints have evolved in a way where that's no longer something that we need to worry about. If it was something we still needed to worry about, the argument would also be, well, why isn't my blue going down into the sponge and then blending in with my yellow and making green? So that also having been said, though, it is very important for you to understand the makeup of your paint. In other words, what I'm saying is if you're using acrylic paints, some of them tend to be alcohol-based paints. And you cannot put alcohol-based paints in a wet palette. I've tried. It doesn't go so good. No surprise there. But if you put metallic alcohol paints in a wet palette, they just don't work. So if you do switch over to a wet palette, you are going to want to keep hard palettes around for things like that. Also, the way that I thin down my metallics is completely different from how I thin down my other paints. So I tend to use hard palettes for my metallics anyway. But if you ever do see metallics in my hard palette, or not my hard palette, but in my wet palette, it's because it's Army Painter paints. Army Painter paints tend to be a little bit thicker. And so I end up having to put them in my wet palette anyway to help thin them down a little bit more and get a smoother finish. Now, that could just be because I'm not used to using Army Painter paints. I do absolutely love and adore their metallics. I think their metallics are just amazing. And they've just put out a new line of metallics, which I'm super excited to try and get my hands on and try out for myself. But that having been said, yeah, if you see metallics in my wet palette in my live streams, it's always Army Painter. And you'll notice that I don't have a problem with doing that. It doesn't bother me. It doesn't hurt anything. So, also, getting metallics in your sponge is not going to then transfer it into whatever you put on your palette next. It doesn't bleed through. Like, even if it bleeds under the paper, it doesn't then pop up somewhere else. That's not how that works. So, strike that one from the record. Myth busted. So we've covered some do's and don'ts, we've covered some myths, and now let's cover the I don't understand what I'm doing wrong. So if you have a wet palette and you know there's plenty of moisture in your wet palette and your paints are still drying, one of the biggest contributing factors is how much you're thinning down the paint and how much you're spreading it around on the palette. If you have a big blob of paint, it's going to retain its moisture a lot better. You may end up with like a very mild skin on the outside that you can just peel off and discard, but that paint underneath that skin is going to stay good for a long, long time, so long as there is moisture in the palette. But if you thin things down to do like glazes or washes, or you're thinning things down to be able to get like minute amount of paint on the brush for doing like feathering or wet blending or things like that, eventually that very thin surface of paint is going to just dry. It is the nature of being exposed to air. A very thin layer of paint is not going to stay good forever, which is why it's important to put down a blob of paint and then thin out from that and then use that. Don't just thin down the entire blob of paint. You'll see that a lot of times in my videos where you'll see a big chunk of paint and then a thinned out section on the palette. So that is one thing to keep in mind. And then finally, I'm going to leave you with the one thing that I don't like about wet palettes, and that's because they're really hard to transport unless you dry them out. Like, I get if you're in a car, you might have a way to be able to transport it, and I get that this is on me. I own a motorcycle, so everything has to fit in a backpack. I can't transport a wet palette. And I've seen people in cars who just put it on its side, despite the fact that there's water in it. And then, obviously, then they complain that the paint's ran. So, is it a pet peeve? Yes. Is it a big deal? No. It's just me. It's me being me. It's just a problem that only pertains to me and other people on motorcycles. If you have a way to keep the palette upright, in theory, as long as you don't overload it with water, you should be able to transport it just fine as long as you transport it flat. But, that having been said, that is my one pet peeve, that it is kind of hard to transport with paint in it. So going back and forth between a local hobby store for paint night and my house, I usually have to completely empty out the palette and make up a fresh palette before I leave to go to the game store, and then dump that out at the game store and then bring back an empty palette. Which means that if I don't finish what I'm working on at the game store, I have to reblend all my paints again, as opposed to using the wet palette the way it's meant to be used to keep your paints good for longer. But I tend to be able to blend up my own paints at this point. I'm pretty good at color matching, so that's less of a problem now with my experience. But as someone who is new to airbrushing, as someone who is new to wet palettes, that can be really frustrating when it comes to transporting your wet palette around, and that's really my only pet peeve. In any case, guys, thanks so much for watching. As always, may your display case always be filled and your pile of shame never run empty. Until next time.